Hello, and welcome to the show Writing in the Tiny House. The entire point of this podcast is to help the tormented artist by sharing what I know about writing, publishing, and stress management so that you can have the tools to produce the content that you have been eager to write. If you have the steps in place, you can produce a short story in as few as 3 months or a novel in as few as 18 months. And hopefully through the ideas in this podcast, you will have the wisdom to adjust that timeline if you need to. I am Devin Davis, the guy who lives and writes in a tiny house in northern Utah. Thank you for tuning in, and please enjoy today's episode of Writing in the Tiny House. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. We are toward the end of NaNoWriMo now, and we are down the home stretch. We are getting to that finish line. I hope that you are well on your way to 50,000 words. And if not, hopefully you can get there some other time. To ask 50,000 words out of somebody in a month is actually a very big demand. And so I hope that throughout this month you have been able to manage your time. You have been able to sit down every day and get closer to that goal. But regardless, we have a few days left. And so I hope that we can all make that final push toward 50,000 words. If you are not participating in NaNoWriMo, this episode is still for you. I trust that you are a writer, and as I have said over the previous 2 episodes, last year I did a mini-series on villains, and I re-released as a way to celebrate the success of those episodes because they were really successful on this podcast. I re-released episodes 1 and 2, and today I'm going to release again the 3rd episode, the 3rd and final episode of that mini-series on villains. So this is all about today, villains and plot. So go ahead and sit back and enjoy the content of today's episode. Have a good day, guys. Best of luck finishing up NaNoWriMo. So let's dive right in to villains and plot. I have a list of 4 pitfalls to avoid when structuring your villain and your plot when you go to do the rough draft of your book or the outline of your book. The first thing to avoid is the hierarchy structure of the villain and his henchmen. The reason why this is kind of hard to avoid is because we like it. We like the idea that once a bad guy is defeated, that there is another bad guy who is stronger, who is more talented, who has more magical powers. And then once that guy is defeated, perhaps there's a third bad guy who is the villain's right-hand man until we finally get to the bad guy himself. The reason why this is so popular is because it's easy to see and it's easy to structure a series around. You have book 1 of the little bad guy, and then it just gets a little bit bigger until book 3 or book 5 or book 7 or however many books are in your series, you finally get to nail the main villain who is behind this entire problem the whole time. It is also a popular way to structure video games. You have the bad guys and you have the henchmen and the little fodder guys that are easy to pick off and are not a very big threat. And in doing those things, the main character, which is you, gains experience points and gets a little stronger and learns some new things. And onward the story progresses. However, this is becoming cliche. This is certainly a trope that has been done time and time again, and it is more common to see villains more like people. It is more common to see heroes more like people. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, it is more common to see a flawed main character and to see a main character make some dark decisions. At the same time, it is becoming more common to see a villain with redeemable qualities, or to see a villain who is completely justified in what they are doing. And so, this structure this hierarchy structure that you have to beat down the fodder before getting to level 2, before getting to level 3 on up to the main big boss at the end, isn't new. It's not fresh. And so find another way to structure the bad guys in your story, especially in your trilogy or in the number of books that you're going to be writing that are related to each other. There are a lot of ways to do it, and at the end of this episode, I'm going to share with you one of the most delightful ways that I found in all of the fantasy fiction that I've read in presenting to you actually a group of 5 books. It is a quintet. So stay tuned until the very end to get that little tidbit. So, the second pitfall to avoid, and granted, you should be avoiding this anyway, it's a thing called plot devices. A plot device, and the reason why I bring this up, this is actually kind of bigger fundamental writing, but a plot device is a thing that happens only because the writer needs it to happen, because something else needs to happen later. A plot device is usually pretty contrived. It sometimes can come out of nowhere, and all that it serves is for the plot to move forward or to save the main character or whatever. It's these little unbelievable things that happen in order for bigger things to happen later, but that is all the good that they serve. One of the most popular plot devices that I can think of is actually in the Chronicles of Narnia, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The children are there in this barren wasteland of frozen ice, and suddenly Santa Claus appears. And Santa comes bearing gifts of lethal weapons. If you think about it, Santa does not belong in Narnia. There are not other people like Santa Claus that populate Narnia. There are, granted, a lot of other fantastical creatures and a lot of fun other characters, but Santa Claus himself does not belong there. And the fact that he appears at the very best time and comes bringing gifts that all of these children are going to need to save the day at the end is the biggest plot convenience I have read in a long time. Granted, it's in a children's story, and we can have more plot conveniences in children's stories if we want to. That's fine. But in the more grown-up stuff, you get to pay attention to your plot conveniences. Some people call this plot armor. It's when the main character simply has to live, because otherwise the book will end too soon. And so, against all odds, they always win. Or, against all odds, they and their central group of friends will win. Or will come out unscathed. And you simply know that just because you know the story. And so it makes things predictable, and it makes things unbelievable to a certain degree. The reason why I bring this up on a villains episode is because not only do you get to think of your main character when you are mapping out your plot, but you also get to think about your villain. When your plot is filled with these conveniences and these devices that make the main character always win, you get to see on the other side of that coin, or the other edge of that sword, what it does to your villain, or how it paints your villain. With these plot devices, sometimes it can make your villain come across as pretty dumb, or come across as way too complicated, way too overthinking things, and not realistic in that way, or it can cheapen such a better, deeper experience with that villain if those plot conveniences were not included. One of these favorites that I like to call out in fantasy fiction specifically, I like to refer to as the Wildcard. It's when the forces of evil are upon us and it looks like the forces of evil are going to win, and we are all in dire straits, but something out of nowhere happens, and it's big, and it was not foreshadowed to begin with, and it's unexpected, and it's a surprise, and to an inexperienced reader, it's probably super awesome, but to the rest of us, it earns kind of an eye roll. I read a book once. I don't necessarily want to call it out on the podcast, but there was a situation similar to what I described. The forces of evil were about to conquer this special magical place, and from out of nowhere, there came a spell that transformed one of the types of magical creatures living in this place into these big warriors. And so these little rinky-dink fairies were transformed into this army of warriors, and the spell happened, and it lasted just long enough for the forces of evil to be abated and for the day to be saved, and then the fairies shrank back down to their normal little fairy selves. The reason why I bring up these things is because you have thought all of these wonderful things through with the villain. You have thought about the awesome ways that the villain is going to come in and threaten the safety of this or that magical place. And to throw in a wild card ending really cheapens all of the effort and all of the believability and all of the energy that you have spent trying to build up a believable villain. And instead, the reader sits back and realizes that regardless, the villain will not win, and it can take them out of the story, and it can convince them not to carry on with the series or even to finish the book. The fourth pitfall that you get to pay attention to is the villain's backstory. Backstories are wonderful. I love a good backstory. However, it has been used a million times that every bad guy was once an abused little boy or girl. Every bad guy, every bad girl, every bad woman was abused when they were little. And while psychologically all of that makes sense, it is also something that is commonly found in all of literature. And what it can do is make excuses for the villain. If you want the villain to simply be bad and to simply be awful, there are other ways to develop backstory to that. There can be something amiss when they were little and they were involved in things that simply fostered that thing that was amiss. There can be interests that they were exposed to when they were little that carried with them as they learned magic or as they learned business, if it's modern contemporary fiction, or there can be a lot of different things like that. If you want them to be abused when they're little, that is fine. It is something that happens all the time in fiction, though, when we do get a good backstory to a villain. And I have read enough and read a wide enough variety of fiction to tell you that not every vicious villain and awful person and person who is threatening to destroy worlds or whatever, not all of them were abused by their dads. There are other ways to do it, and to find those ways is fascinating. And it makes the writing so much better and so much easier to follow along, and it really catches your interest and holds it there when it is new and it is fresh. So let me take a moment with this book review. I'm going to be reviewing The Cleric Quintet by R.A. Salvatore. R.A. Salvatore was one of my very favorite authors when I was in high school. I have since, now that I've gained some more experience in reading and in writing, I've come to find that sometimes his magic systems are a little bit convenient. But I'm going to talk about this particular series of 5 books. They're 5 short-ish books, I believe, or 5 average-sized books. It's not a monstrous series. But The Cleric Quintet is about this young man named Catterley who studies at a library and comes to learn the big mysteries of magic. And over the course of 5 books, you see it happen. And you really come to understand just how powerful this young man becomes. And it was a really cool progression to see it over 5 books and to see actual power happen and to see the learning of spells or the manipulation of matter or whatever was really delightful to me. At the same time, though, and this is the type of villain that I love to see the very, very most. This villain starts out with Catterley, studying at the same library. This structure didn't have a school, it didn't have classes, it didn't have teachers, it didn't have that type of structure. It just had this library of knowledge, and everybody from everywhere came to this library to learn and to gain more knowledge that way. There was another young man studying alongside Catterley. They weren't friends, and this young man is kind of an awful person. He wasn't talented. He was clumsy. Granted, Catterley was also clumsy. But over the progression of these 5 books, you watch this untalented, jealous, horrible man, young man, gradually become the darkest, most threatening monster that comes about in book 5. And it is delightful to see. And it was so fun to read. And that is the type of villain that I appreciate the very most, where you see perhaps an amount of foreshadowing, you see character traits and you see people in the very beginning of the story, and you think maybe this guy is going to end up being something bad or doing something awful. And over the course of it all, you see the background, you see the story unfold, you see the reason why this person chooses to be where they are, and you understand their attitudes toward this or that. It makes the villain so much more believable and so much more awesome. It is this type of villain that I am choosing to write in my current work in progress, or at least as part of it. Right now I have 2 half-finished books. In one of them, that's totally how the villain is going to be unfolded. In the other one, it's going to be different. But that is how it is in this book. So if you are interested in checking out the Cleric Quintet, please follow the affiliate links in the description of this podcast episode. And yeah, I give this entire work of 5 books. R.A. Salvatore has written a lot of books. And like I said, he was one of my favorites in high school. He was one of the Forgotten Realms authors. Did wonderful stuff. One of his characters, Dritz Do'Urden, who is a dark elf, is considered to be one of the most liked in all of fantasy fiction. And this is written by him. So go ahead and follow those links. I give these 5 books easily 4 out of 5 stars. They were so much fun, but I reflect on some of the things and there was an amount of convenience to them. But it was a great read. It was fast-paced. And the magic and the fighting in R.A. Salvatore's writing is so much fun. It is so easy to get caught up in all of those wonderful moments. And that is it for today. Go ahead and follow me on social media. On Instagram, I am at author Devin Davis. On Twitter, I am at author Devin D. And I also have an account on TikTok. Go ahead and find my information in the show notes of this episode. And remember that my short story Brigitte, which was published last fall, is available on Amazon as an ebook and on Audible as an audiobook. Go ahead and check those things out today. And be sure to join me on next week's episode of Writing in the Tiny House. Run by copy editor Chrissy Barton, Little Syllables Editing is a reliable resource for anyone looking to improve their manuscript. Chrissy does line edits, copy edits, and the final proofread for experienced writers and newbies alike. Go to littlesyllables.com and reach out to Chrissy today. A link is in the show notes.